afternoon, everyone, and a huge thank you to coming here today. This is, of course, Judgement by Our Peers. Is the jury out? My name is Asha Shah. I'm a paralegal at the Financial Ombudsman Service, and I will be chairing the discussion here today. Before I start, I want to just say a big thank you to the Legal Action Group who are sponsoring this part of the debate. I'm very grateful for their contribution. This is, of course, part of the legal challenges strand of the battle of ideas. So we're here to discuss the jury system, and this is, of course, a debate that's gone on for quite a long time. But I think there is a modern angle to this, particularly in light of the Oscar Pistorius trial that just took place. There were some criticisms there of the decision not to have a jury at that trial. And before that, if anyone remembers the Vicky Price trial, where the judge was very, very critical of the jury members' understanding. I think he said something along like, they have a fundamental deficit in understanding the case. This was after they asked a number of questions that suggested that they did not quite get what was going on in the trial. The format of the debate today is that I'll introduce the speakers very, very briefly. They'll have 5 minutes each to give a speech, and then we'll take questions from the audience. At the very end, we'll again have some brief final remarks from the panelists. So, the first speaker we have today is Carl Gardner, who's at my very far right. He's a writer and a blogger. I'm sure many of you will have heard of headoflegal.com, which is a very, very popular legal blog. Alongside that, he is also a lecturer, a barrister, and I believe he's writing his first book on the UK Constitution. To my left is Andrew Wheelhouse, just recently introduced. A very special thanks to Andrew for being here. We had a last-minute dropout, and he has come here in the 11th hour. Andrew is a paralegal at the moment, specializing in media law. He also has a special interest in public law. Very interestingly, Andrew also just returned from an internship at the South African High Court, where he was a clerk. So I'll be interested to hear your views on the Oscar Pistorius trial. To my very right is Luke. Luke is a criminal lawyer at Human Solicitors. He's also the convener of the London Legal Salon and the legal editor of the online magazine Spiked. Now, I'll just go straight into it and start off with Carl in your 5 minutes.
Thanks. The jury's not out with me. It's very, very in with me. So I'm for it or them. What's the alternative? The alternative is trial by judge. A panel, I guess, of judges or a judge alone. And people who argue for that usually say, well, it will be fairer, it would be better, judges are more educated people, more experienced, particularly in dealing with crime and so on, and they're less likely to be swayed by emotions and passions. And judges would give reasons for their judgments. Basically, I don't believe in any of those things. Either I think they're false or they're reasons not for wanting judges. First of all, I don't think that educated upper middle class people are more rational or fairer or more sensible than anyone else. In fact, I'd go a bit further and I'd say I think they might be less so. Educated people and lawyers, and judges are lawyers, of course, they're less independent than we are, less independent than we think, I would say. We're exposed to a narrower range of opinion than non-lawyers, and I think we are more likely to succumb to received wisdoms, not so much the view of the mob as the view of the drinks party, perhaps. And the reason we don't realise that is because mostly we agree with the received ideas. We think these ideas are natural and uncontroversial, and that's where the danger is. Take human rights, for instance. Most lawyers would disagree with the Conservative proposals on human rights. I disagree with them. I think they're rubbish, right? But the point is that you can identify a legal opinion on that issue. Legal aid would be another thing. So I'm not saying these lawyerly ideas are wrong, but they are often shared, and that's the danger in it. As I think that's one of the dangers. Another strength of juries is anonymity. We often overlook. In the internet age, we shouldn't, but we do. That means juries' decisions can be truly fearless in a way that judges' decisions, judges who we can identify and who would feel fear and shame potentially about getting what the public perceives to be the wrong decision, that's an advantage of the juries. A practical example of what I'm talking about is the law of rape, which a lot of people want to discuss in this context. I'm worried about the low conviction rate in rape cases, particularly as a proportion of reported rapes. I share that feeling that a lot of lawyers do, and I would support some measures to overcome it. But it's precisely that agreement that makes it all the more important that the public is in a position to check the zeal of people like me and other lawyers. So there'll be dangers in taking juries out of the system. Look at defendants. Juries are fairer to defendants too. I could mention Clive Ponting, some of you will remember. Nearer to our time, there was a chap called Paul Chambers who was convicted in the Twitter joke trial of an offence, lost 2 jobs. After 3 appeals, on a 3rd appeal, he had his conviction quashed. And one of the interesting features about that case, I think, is had he ever had the right to go before a jury, had his offence been serious enough, I don't think any appeal would have been needed, never mind 3. Finally, people talk about reasons, or a judge would give reasons, whereas juries don't. But, I mean, we had hours of reasons from the judge in the Oscar Pistorius case, I think. Hours and hours. It still looks to me as though she split the difference, fudged it, and convicted him of something, rather than the thing he was really accused of. You know, the fact is we can't often explain completely rationally things that are key to a good judgment. I think everybody knows that. If we didn't know it, nobody would have been concerned about a defendant who wanted to give evidence fully veiled a few months ago. So trial by jury, I think, is fairer than trial by judge would ever be. It's fairer to defendants, fairer to victims, in as much as that matters. And we traditionally think of it as a right, and I think that's correct, and we should defend it like any other human rights.
Thank you very much, Carl. I'll turn to the next speaker, Andrew.
Thank you. Ordinarily, I'm a strong believer in the jury system, but it looks like we've already got 2 of those people on the panel, so I don't really want to bore you. What I would like to do is just play devil's advocate for a moment based on my experiences of another jurisdiction. When I worked in South Africa for the Constitutional Court, many of my colleagues would look at me with some consternation and say, but in the UK you have trial by jury. I mean, what is that? What is that all about? Which probably tells you more about the fear and loathing in South Africa of the middle classes for the rest of the population. But still, I think it is a point worth exploring. South Africa abolished the right to trial by jury in 1969, but the right had all but been abandoned by the opponents of apartheid by that time. The reasons for this are obvious. There is no way the Rivonia trialists or activists like the campaigning lawyer and communist Bram Fischer would have received a fair trial from an all-white jury. This is my first point. It demonstrates that there is nothing magical about jury trials and that a successful jury system is predicated on a certain amount of societal harmony. Anecdotal evidence of this is present in the fact that there has been no widespread enthusiasm for the reintroduction of trial by jury in South Africa. A few years ago, Pierre de Vos, a well-known public law scholar at the University of Cape Town, slapped down the suggestion made in the newspaper The Sowetan that a reintroduction of the jury would serve as an affirmation of the rationality of the citizen and as an effective brake on state power. He presents us with this scenario. Imagine a white farmer is charged with murdering a black farm worker and the jury is made up of 7 township residents and 2 white farmers. A good lawyer will play to the possible racist fears and prejudices of the white jurors who might be eager to believe that the farmer acted in self-defense. How often would the state be able to secure a conviction, convincing all 9 jurors of the guilt of the accused in such circumstances? Not all white jurors would be swayed by the lawyer's tactics, of course, but some will. Now, if that sounds deeply patronising to these hypothetical Boers sitting on this hypothetical South African jury, that is because it is. And De Vos candidly admits that he distrusts all South Africans equally, which at least demonstrates that in the democratic era, intellectual snobbery in South Africa is colourblind. But there is something to this in terms of our ability to defend the right to trial by jury in two respects. First, how far can we push the envelope in defending juries' decisions? This is something which we see, as much as I admire and agree with his writing in some of Luke's articles defending juries. There's arguably a certain guillotining of debate. Jury made its decision, seems reasonable enough. You weren't there, man. You weren't there. Okay? Now, what motivates this, and is it a good thing? I would argue that it's not. This lack of reasons is not a good thing. It involves a trade-off, and it's arguing that this lack of reasons is outweighed by the civic virtue with which a jury system is legitimated. Now, contrast this with the free-for-all that followed Justice Thokozile Masipa's judgment in the Pistorius case and the fiery comment that followed the negative verdicts of racist magistrates into the deaths of detainees in custody during apartheid, and of course, as we will no doubt see in the near future, at the outcome of the Davani trial. And one has to ask why members of the jury should be given special treatment. Secondly, could De Vos's cynical scenario in fact be correct, even to some extent? We're talking about a society that is deeply divided along class and racial lines to this day. To put it another way, think of the boogeyman in the Pistorius trial that everyone knew was there, but which no one wanted to talk about. The non-existent burglar that Mr. Pistorius claimed to be shooting at, of course, statistically very likely to be black. How would a randomly chosen jury, again, statistically speaking, likely a majority of black South Africans have regarded this? Would they have been pissed off and more likely to send Pistorius down, despite the efforts of his expensive white legal team? Would the South African paranoia of crime have kicked in and made him sympathise with him? Or would they have followed the straight and narrow path of weighing up all the evidence? I just want to leave you with one final thought. Comparative law demonstrates that in this area there is more than one way to skin a cat. In other words, many countries get by without jury trials or with only limited citizen input into decisions made within the legal system. It is hard to push jury trial up there with other essential elements of the rule of law, such as judicial independence, impartial and reasonable administrative decision-making, and that sort of thing. The danger for people like me, when I defend the jury system to my South African colleagues, is that the alternative starts to look plausible. And if that happens, we have to consider if the opponents of juries are merely pushing at an open door. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And lastly, Luke.
I'm very keen to start with Andrew's remarks with regards to the reasons and juries giving reasons for their decisions. And I think this really goes to the heart of why the jury system and defenders of juries in this country and in this region have lost their way. I seriously think the way that we talk about juries has to be quite radically reconsidered, which is why I take a completely different focus from Carl, although I share some of his residual benefits to the jury system. I'd say that the starting point for a contemporary defence of the jury must be a democratic one. It must be celebrating the jury's role as a democratic safeguard against the powers of the state. And that argument, that reason for defending the jury has all but disappeared from the contemporary discussion. So going back to reasons, why is it a good thing that the jury doesn't have to give reasons for their decision? Well, that hasn't always been the case. Of course, up until the 17th century, late 17th century, it was the case that judges had powers to basically imprison jurors for delivering the wrong verdict. So jurors were very much a sort of procedural, ceremonial presence in the courtroom. They had no real power to deliver a verdict according to what they wanted. They simply had to play a mouthpiece and legitimise the rulings of the king and of the assizes. That all changed in 1670 with the landmark case of Bushell, where a judge tried to imprison a jury he did imprison the jury for some days for delivering a verdict which he considered to be contrary to the evidence. The jury simply refused to change their mind, refused to offer any justification whatsoever, and instead issued what's called a writ of habeas corpus, a declaration that they had been falsely imprisoned by the trial judge. That was successful, and ever since, the jury have not had to give reasons for their judgments, and it has been recognised at common law that the jury can deliver whatever verdict is in accordance with their conscience as well as the evidence. So the failure, or the fact that they don't have to give reasons for their judgments, illustrates something absolutely central to the history of the jury. And that is that this is a system born out of admonition to state power. What I mean by that is that the reason why the jury is so central is precisely because it has been, for 400 years, the means through which the people reject the authority of the law. And it's been very effective in doing so. So what it's called is jury nullification. And I think it's an interesting point to start talking about what a new defence of the jury might look like. So when the jury trial gets transposed over to the United States, they tend to take this point very, very seriously. And juries effectively are told throughout for a long period of time in the early days of the jury trial, that they had to judge not just the evidence and come to a conclusion on the truth of the evidence and the truth of the facts, but also come to a verdict which was in accordance with their conscience. And it was an extremely important part of the trial process. So when it came to slavery law in the 19th century, you had a series of cases in which were brought under the legislation which prohibited the harbouring of slaves, so looking after escaped slaves. And northern juries simply refused to convict. There's a whole series of cases where there was overwhelming evidence that a defendant had harboured a slave in accordance with the law and broken the law, but nonetheless the jury was acquitted. And what did this mean? Did this mean that they were acting merely as a tribunal of fact, or were they delivering verdicts which were in accordance with their conscience? And I think that is the absolutely vital aspect of the jury's role, which today has been under attack and is too often ignored by defenders of the jury system and too often ignored by, obviously, detractors of the jury system. But it's not just ignored by them, it's actually ignored by the legal profession. If you go and sit on a jury today, you will be told that you are a tribunal of fact and not of the law. You are told repeatedly that that the judge will tell you what the law is, and you must make your verdict in accordance with the law. No judge in this country will tell you that you have to find the facts and then find that your verdict is in accordance with your conscience. In fact, in the United States, a state has just passed a law obliging judges to tell juries about their power to nullify. And it's a far more active debate as it is in the States than it is here. So I've realised I've only got 1 minute left. To sum up, really, I think today's discussion of the jury has significantly lost its way. It's lost its way because we too often make the arguments that Carl made, arguments around the effectiveness, the impartiality of a jury, the fact that they are the most effective way of finding the truth. Or you hear the arguments that are made against the jury, which are basically the same arguments, but saying that the judge happens to be the best way of finding the truth. The judge happens to be the best way of establishing the facts. What I think we need is a new defence of the jury, one which attempts to capture the spirit of the jury, the tradition of the jury, and that is a democratic tradition, one which allows the jury in the courtroom to act as the conscience of society, to act as our representatives in the face of the force of the law. And as I was summing up my research, I found this perfect quote from John Locke from his Second Treatise of Government. And this is, something like 350 years old. And thus the community perpetually retains the supreme power of saving themselves from the attempts and designs of any body, even of their legislators, whenever they shall be so foolish or so wicked as to lay and carry on designs against the liberties and properties of the subject.
Thank you, Luke. So in a moment, I'll open up the questions to the audience. Before I do so, I have a quick point or two to make, and it's really directed at both of you on this side of the room. In light of the reports recently that a lot of jury members are going away and conducting Google searches on people, the accused and witnesses, and the amount of information now that we as individuals put online. For example, there might be some rather incriminating or, perceived to be incriminating photos of people looking very drunk online or maybe holding, guns and so on. In light of that, do you not think there's a new argument now that now more than ever the jury system really can't stand up?
Well, and my response to the sort of Googling juror problem is that we need to stop them. I realise that's not an easy thing to achieve, and we're probably not going to achieve it completely, but I mean, one of the things that the last Attorney General did, Dominic Grieve, was raise the profile of this issue, and it kind of basically announced to the world that he was going to get tough on it, and there was some prosecutions and so on, and I supported that. What are the alternatives? The alternative is to make it a free-for-all of any juror can Google anything. I suppose there would be a case for that, but it would drive a coach and horses through rules of evidence. I'm not in favour of that. And the alternative would be to abolish juries. So I would say get tough about it. If I can just in 1 minute respond to Luke. I'm not sure our arguments are all that different, and I don't think I'm giving some kind of old, boring, usual defence of juries, actually. With respect, Luke, I think in a way I'm going beyond you, because what you're saying is the traditional thing about juries being a safeguard against the state. What I'm saying is that it's not just about that. The problem with the argument from the other side is that it's kind of preferring the authority of an elite. And I see the jury as a safeguard not just against the state, but against elites. And I think that's a new defence of the jury.
Well, so first of all, on this stuff about Googling, I actually think that lawyers can afford to be far more relaxed about jurors Googling things. It seems we are obsessed with jurors going outside what we present to them about the case. And I've not questioned it. We get told this over and over again in legal circles. We're absolutely obsessed with keeping the court a cleansed environment. Why? The point is that, really, lawyers don't trust jurors at all to be sensible about what they might find on their Google searches, right? So I'm not saying it should be a free-for-all. I'm not saying we should drive a coach and horses through the rules of evidence. But I think there are legitimate questions to be raised about the rules of evidence, actually. I think there's legitimate questions to be raised about what it says about how we think jurors think. I mean, the first thing that jurors get told is judge a case on the evidence, right? If you trust jurors to judge a case on the evidence, the fact they go away and happen to Google something doesn't necessarily indicate that they're going to pay any less heedance to the evidence at all, I don't think. So I think we can just afford to be far more relaxed about it, and I certainly don't see it as I see those arguments as really an attack on the integrity and judgment of the jury, which I think is a mistake. In terms of whether or not it's what I'm talking about is using the jury as a forum for judging the law as well as the fact, okay? Judging the validity of the law which is governing the trial that they're in. And you very rarely I've never heard in contemporary times any defender of the jury make that point. But it's always been the case that jurors have the right to make that call. They have the right to say, the evidence in accordance with this law is there, but I'm not going to convict, because frankly, I think the law is ridiculous. Call it a safeguard against elites or against the state. I think that, the state is an elite in some sense, but really one and the same. What I'm arguing for is that we need to reinvigorate our respect with the jury to the extent that we trust them to do a lot more and go beyond the remits that they're currently told they're able to.
And before we go to the audience, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think discussing the sort of alleged split between Carl and Luke's position is interesting, because it brings to the fore the sort of question of what your sort of general conception of law is and what it is for. I think going back to discussing sort of comparative approaches, I think it is quite clear that a lot of countries that we would regard as mature democracies, completely perfectly well-functioning democracies, get by without juries or only have juries in quite limited circumstances. And this isn't something that we're completely immune from in this country. You have the example in Northern Ireland, where you had diplock courts, where juries were out, judge as the sole decision maker was in. And it was because, going back to what I was saying earlier, of this need for a certain amount of societal harmony before you can have a functioning jury system. I would like to see if anyone's going to be so bold as to suggest that at the height of the Troubles, people were up for terrorist offences would have got a fair hearing from a jury composed of the other side, as it were. But it makes it seem as though trial by jury is in some ways a bolt-on extra. It's nice if you can have it. It's not necessarily the core function of what law and legal decision-making is necessarily about.
Thank you. We'll take questions from the audience.
I'd just like to start by saying, in an earlier discussion on judicial activism, there were quite a lot of views stating that people found the judges were interpreting law in their own favour, that they were misrepresenting the views of Parliament, and in that way it seemed a lot of the decisions were undemocratic. So I just wonder what people think if you perceive the judges to act in that way, and how that would impact on one particular person who's alleged to have committed a crime and their life and their liberties at stake. And also, I'd just like to say that the criminal justice system is based on the idea that if someone has allegedly committed a crime so harmful to society and social values, that it's up to the state to prosecute that person and make right or instill a sense of balance back into society. And if that's what the criminal justice system is based upon, then in that sense the juries are essentially reflecting the values of society and in a way are putting their views across, or our views across, into that particular system and into the workings of justice. And I do believe in that way then the juries do play a core and essential role in justice in this country.
Firstly, it's staggering to hear a lawyer say that he's happy to see people tried on the basis of evidence that isn't put before the jury but is just found by someone on their computer. That, I think, would reduce trials to a fight as to who could get to the top of the Google search results. And you can see that being exploited by PR companies and internet whiz kids if you have wealthy defendants. It's interesting also to hear that jurors are Googling and we need to stop them. That seems to suggest that there is a fundamental malfunction in the way that the arbitration of justice is being meted out. On the one hand, we had a defence from Mr. Gardner saying jurors are fantastic, and on the other hand, well, they're obviously doing a lot wrong and we need to clamp down on it. That's a strange contradiction. We talk about them being a democratic safeguard. In other circumstances, the panel would uniformly agree that judges are a democratic safeguard. And of course, the alternative here isn't a magic 8-ball, although you get as many reasons from a magic 8-ball as you would a jury. The alternative is a judge who would be able to provide a reasoned discourse on the reasons for the decision. With anonymity, you say, comes fearlessness, but it also comes a complete lack of responsibility. It comes at the benefit of not being held to account for your decision at all. And of course, the real elephant in the room here, the thing that none of you will, I think, address with any intellectual honesty, is that the majority of criminal cases in this country are decided by juries of 3. They're decided by magistrates who have a conviction rate of 96%. These are the same wise, benevolent individuals, but yet I doubt you would consider the justice they meter out to be that of the quality of jurors. And lastly, why is it, if juries are so fantastic, that no wealthy individual or multinational company entering into any form of contract or dispute that I've ever encountered has said that the arbitration clause or the decision-making panel for their dispute of any value or significance whatsoever should be 12 randomly selected members of the public? Why do they prefer professionals who know the law and who know how to distinguish between their personal views of an individual and the facts before them?
I'm not going to make a point really, I just want to raise some awareness, because I myself am from the Netherlands, where we don't have jury trials, trial by jury. And I'm just really, like I said, I'm astounded. It's funny, because I never expected this when I came into this room. Because I feel there's such a huge love for jury kind of trials here in this room, which is funny because when you go to the Netherlands, how I grew up, we have the opposite. So instead of seeing some kind of right for trial by jury, we see that as a fundamental danger of being trialed by people, random people, biased people, of being left in the hands, your life put in the hands of people that might just decide anything about you without any professionality in their choice. So it's funny, I just came in this room, I was like, whoa, this world is weird. I thought the English were quite like Dutch, you know? I thought so. But this part of culture is very different, and I just want to raise this awareness so that we would start arguing from the opposite, and we would come to very different conclusions. I would never support trial by jury for myself. I feel that my freedom would be kind of, I would lose my freedom in some sense. And for you, it's the opposite. So just consider this when you think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll return to the panel. That last comment in particular I thought was very interesting. Luke, do you want to go back on that to begin with?
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. For me, it makes me very proud to sit in a room and have a room full of where at least the respect for the jury is part and parcel of the way we talk about the law. I think that's a wonderful thing. But going on to the idea of professional juries, I think that's really, because that's a lot of the time people say, yeah, I'm for juries, but I think they should be professional. And of course, that's what magistrates are. They're professional juries, basically. They're lay persons. They get advised on every aspect of the law, but they're members of the public, and the principle is that there just happen to be 3 of them rather than 12. The difference is, of course, that they're actually far more, the acquittal rates in the Crown Court, famously, are far higher than in the Magistrates' Court. And if you want a client to take a punt, you put them in front of a jury because they're far more likely to get an acquittal. The reason for that is that when you introduce professionalism into this judgment, you change the nature of it, I think, fundamentally. My understanding of what the juries do, what I'm arguing for, is for the jury to make a judgment not as to fact, which is often quite straightforward, okay? You don't really need to be a professional to decide if someone was in a place or not, or if, or to decide what are often very simple issues of matters an issue that arise in criminal trials. You don't need to be a professional to decide them. What you do need to be a member of society to decide is whether or not that person is guilty in accordance with your own conscience. And that's why we retain the system. That's why we retain the system in the way that we do, because I think residually there is still a respect for the democratic principle of the jury. There is still an idea in the English system, which has always been part of the English system, that an important component of it is the democratic approval of the law being enacted in that way in that particular case. I think that's what we recognise in England. And if you professionalise that, if you say, well, we need professional juries, we need magistrates who are professionally qualified to make that call, it becomes, well, what are you professionalising? My question would be, well, what do you have to be professional in order to ascertain it? And that's what, of course, marks it out from difference to other arbitrations. It's a very different nature of question. The question is fundamentally different. It's not a question of expertise, it's a question of finding certain facts and then exercising your judgment and your conscience in relation to the facts that you find, which is not the same as in a contract case, for example. Just very quickly on the Googling point, I think, look, you and I have fundamentally different opinions of jurors and of the public. And, you know, all the evidence that I've seen in the past is that jurors take their duties incredibly seriously, they're very diligent, and I think if you... in terms of this rich guy who pushes his desired Google searches up, I mean, I think it just seems to me, one major barrier I face when I get a new client is if they're rich, because you're already facing an uphill struggle, right? But I think juries are more sophisticated than that, and I think that's at the fundamental level. You and I just simply disagree about how sophisticated the public are. I think they're more sophisticated than you give them credit for.
Andrew, would you like to come back on any of the comments?
Yeah, sort of putting aside my sort of sceptical hat for one side, I was intrigued by the Dutch gentleman's comments about how he would never ever want to be put in front of an English jury, which sort of begs the question, you know, whoever said, I mean, we've been talking about all these cases where we celebrate the good sense of the jury. We think about Bushell's case. We think about the acquittal of Captain Thomas Preston and his men by a jury of Massachusetts, by a jury of Massachusetts men following the Boston massacre. And you know, whoever said at the end of a case, "Thank God for Mr. Justice so and so." Okay, I think any common law system lawyer with an ounce of romance in his soul, feels something for the jury system, because it is something that is rooted very deeply in our culture. But again, putting that to one side, it is something that you can regard as sort of an optional extra, which was alluded to by the gentleman down there. Other countries just don't see it that way. Other countries see the process of legal decision-making as a technical thing, as a sort of maybe boringly scientific thing, and things seem to go all right. I think one of the interesting points about comparing other jurisdictions to our jurisdiction or other places where they have jury trials is how judgmental are those arguing in favour of jury trials prepared to be. Are you prepared to turn around to all these other perfectly well-functioning or at least equally dysfunctional liberal democracies and say, no, the way you're doing it is crap. You need to get onto this jury stuff. I mean, it very much seems to be something that is becoming more and more of a niche pursuit as we look at legal systems around the world. And just quickly on what the gentleman in the blazer was saying about how no party to a contractual dispute would dream of having or submitting to the jurisdiction of an English jury. It is something that needs to be addressed because there are certain civil matters in this country where you can still have election for trial by jury, and most of the time parties don't want that. My firm deals with a lot of defamation work, and they wouldn't touch juries with a barge pole. They're seen as being far too unpredictable, particularly in the sort of crisis of authority that we have from various bits of the establishment at the moment, where no one trusts Westminster, no one trusts the press. If you've got a defamation case where you've got the government and the press, who knows what the hell is going to happen in that sort of situation? So people do trust British judges looking when they're looking to this country from abroad, and they are often quite baffled by British juries.
Carl?
Yeah, can I respond to the point that came from the Netherlands first of all? I completely understand that. I'm very, very familiar actually with the Dutch reactions to what I've been saying. I'm in no sense a kind of Anglo-Saxon legal supremacist. I think there's lots we can learn from other systems. But you had what you were saying about you'd fear your life being in a jury's hands. And the answer to that, why we feel the way we do, was in the statistics that Luke quoted. Because that's right. Actually, your life would be safer in the hands of a jury. More widely, again, we're often told, oh, the rest of the world does X, therefore Britain must. I'm not trying to tell the rest of the world it has to change. I respect what they do. Same as I respect the written constitution of the US. I think it's a brilliant product of intelligent design. But that doesn't mean that we should have a written constitution. So all I'm saying is let's play cricket and baseball and korfball or whatever all at the same time. Judicial activism was mentioned. I've already said I think some political conservative attitudes to law I think are rubbish, so I'm not in that camp. But I am concerned about judicial activism, and that is precisely the kind of elite point that I was trying to make. On irresponsible juries, well, let's hear what the irresponsible decisions are that we've had from juries. Magistrates were mentioned. Exactly, magistrates are not the same as juries. Magistrates are judges who repeatedly look at cases, whether they're professional or not. And finally, the question about companies. Why don't companies want juries? Well, one answer is that that they want an arbitration on points of law as well. But another, the cheekier answer is this. You better ask them. My answer might be precisely because they are sort of professional elites and want judgment by professional elites like them. But would it actually be fairer if their disputes were determined by ordinary people, it might.
Can we have some more questions from the audience, please?
It's a question mainly for Luke, although I'm interested in everyone's views. Do you think, is it as important to defend the jury's conviction as it is to defend the jury's acquittal? Or, I mean, if we want to trust the jury, do we need to trust them when they think there's a case to convict as well? Or is the safeguard that you were talking about really mainly or even only in the case of acquittal?
Hi. I've got two questions for the panel. One is, would you welcome jury research, i.e. research into how juries do make their decisions? And secondly, do you think juries should have the power to throw a case out at half-time if they think it's really rubbish?
I come from a non-legal background, but it just strikes me a couple of things. Why would I trust a jury more than I would professionals? And it strikes me that you, as a jury member, you can put yourself in the place of a person that is before the court, whereas a professional can't do that. A lawyer or a judge does this, it's their data, it's their bread and butter, it's what they do every single day. A professional cannot put themselves in the place of a person in the same way that a jury might be able to. A jury member is an ordinary average member of the public, and I would trust an ordinary average member of the public to relate to me if I was a defendant in a particular case. And I would vastly prefer a jury of ordinary average people like myself rather than a panel of professionals. So that would be my, sort of from a non-legal perspective, why I would want that. And also, I think around the Googling issue, it strikes me that why would we trust judges with a lot of information that we wouldn't trust jury members with? It strikes me that why, this information is out there, this information is available, why is it better off in the hands of professionals than it is in the hands of other people? People should have as much information as they can. Now, I would ask the panel whether, for instance, knowledge of prior conviction should be in there, because it strikes me that that can prejudice a trial and that would create a difficulty. And the last point I would make is, with relation to the US system, it strikes me that it's far more democratic than here. And rather than saying you have that and we have this, you should have a US system over here. It's much more democratic. The judges in the US are elected. I think that's a lot more fair and democratic. And the system here strikes where they're appointees. They're not accountable to anybody, whereas at least in the United States, they are accountable to the people who elect them.
I liked Luke's arguments defending the jury in terms of their democratic role. I wonder whether there's an uphill struggle using that kind of language, because rhetorically, in a whole host of areas outside the legal system, the notion of democratising is very popular. The idea of democratising culture. In the public sector where I work, citizens' forums are set up, involving people in decision-making is all the rage. But at the same time, there seems to be this undermining of the jury system, this attack on the jury system, which presumably is why this debate is taking place. So where's that coming from? If there's this apparent commitment to democracy, why are juries having such a hard time?
Thanks. Related to what the lady over there was saying, yeah, setting up different countries. You can tell from the accent that I am from the other side of the pond. One of the elements that the panel hasn't addressed, which I'd really like to consider, is the amount of research that has gone on into what happens within a jury room. Now, 25 years ago, I was reading about and writing papers on the dynamics, on group dynamics in juries. And 25 years ago, there was so much evidence about how much decision-making was not based on facts, but on interpersonal dynamics, the personality, when you have a strong person in a group influencing the model of groupthink that was very applicable to juries. I don't think it's really productive to set up a kind of, our country is better than your country is better than our country. Rather, I think it would be useful to look at different models and say, what do we learn from this? What do we learn from that? And the concern I have, and why I'd like this addressed, and I'm disappointed it hasn't been up to now, is that it seems like juries are being spoken about in a very monolithic manner and often a very idealizing manner in this discussion. And I think it would be really useful to get rid of just some monolithic notion of jury and actually start to talk about if the only alternative is, say, an individual judge or magistrate, and we do want to have members of society at large making those decisions, then rather than treat that in some generic way, I'd like the panel to address what is the fairest, best way they think that those juries should be comprised, selected, what have you. Because I do realize the British system's quite different from America, and there are pluses and minuses on both sides, but one of the things that's come out of all the American expert research and the voir dire system is how much members of a jury are influenced by factors that have nothing to do with the facts of the case. It can be everything from the color of the suit of the barrister to, whatever, to the force of personality of the person sitting next to them in the jury room. So it would be great to hear a bit of your perspectives on that.
Can you say how widespread is jury nobbling? The other piece of information I'd like to share with you all. I went to the Old Bailey the day after Andy Coulson was found guilty. The judge had to hear applications from the defendants who were not sentenced yet. And they were saying because the Prime Minister has described Andy Coulson as a dishonest person and the case was discussed on Newsnight the previous night, they were asking for the action to be struck off. The judge praised the jury, saying they have been on this case for 6 months. The judge also said he has watched the Newsnight program and didn't want to give the action. And he went one step further, saying since the jurors have done such a good job, they don't have to do jury service for the rest of their life unless they wish to do so. I don't think we'll get a more interesting case than this to illustrate how the judiciary deals with the judge.
Kerry Dingle from WORLDwrite, School of Citizen TV. I am a bit concerned that Britain is prepared to lecture the entire world on how to live its life, yet it's not prepared to big up something that might be worth telling the world about, which is a more democratic legal system in terms of juries. One thing, Andrew, I'm shocked that you can rewrite history by suggesting somehow the no jury diplomat courts in Ireland were to ensure that there was some sort of lack of a lynch mob. They were lynch mob courts to lock up Republicans, completely one-sided, run by the British state, the opposite of what it was trying to do, supposedly at home, by the use of juries to keep people more on side. I do think we should tell the world that we think having a jury in a more democratic system is entirely superior to stone throwing, to what goes on in the Netherlands and everywhere else for that matter. But I think what we're in danger of doing is going down the Netherlands road, and unfortunately the South African road, which is highly elitist, which says we can't trust our peers, which treats them with contempt. And that's the political framework in which this debate is taking place. And unless we start treating our friends and our peers as people we can trust, what does that say about ourselves? It means we have no faith in who we really are and who we look to. And everything has to be an official, a third party and a professional. And I think that's dangerous and I think it's damaging.
Carl, I'll start with you, and in particular there was a point about having US type elected judges in the UK. I'd like to hear some comments about that, please.
Yeah, no, I'm against that, and haven't really thought about it much before preparing today, but I'm against it. I don't think that would lead to better judges, and in fact, in some ways, lack of accountability is good. That's one of the good things about the jury, so, I'm not sure that would help. Just trying to respond to a few points. Does defending the jury mean defending convictions as well, was asked. For my part, yes. I think it's the logic of it. If we basically trust juries to acquit, we must trust them to convict. And the argument of, well, you weren't there, you can't criticise the verdict, must apply both ways. Would I welcome research? Yes, I do welcome research, very much. There has been, Professor Cheryl Thomas couldn't be with us today, and her research, a really interesting paper called Are Juries Fair, from a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now, is well worth reading. She basically concludes that they are fair, by and large, and that many of the instinctive fears we have about juries are really myths. And it's quite an in-depth study. Should juries be able to throw cases out at half-time? That's a really interesting question, which I hadn't thought about before. Maybe, I'm a little bit worried about the consequences of if they have a big argument about that at half-time, then if they decided not to, could they really fairly look at the defence case later? But, you know, if they decided there was a case to answer, would that, as it were, shift a burden of proof? So I'm a bit worried about that. What else have I got to say? Just groupthink. Sure, there's groupthink among juries. My point is there's groupthink among judges as well. Why do we think judges are free of it? Jury selection as random as possible is what I would want, except that I oppose the change that allowed lawyers and police officers to sit on juries. I think that was most unwise. These people know too much, so they're dangerous in a way. Well, you know, I don't agree with that. I don't know how prevalent jury nobbling is. And let me just briefly defend the Netherlands very quickly. I said I wasn't a supremacist, and I'm not. I mean, there are other areas in life where I think we could hugely learn from them. It's a much more equal society than Britain, for instance. So there's lots we can learn from other countries, but there are contributions we can make as well. Not everything in this country is bad, and I like juries.
Thank you. Luke?
Okay, so just on this point about acquittals versus convictions, it's a really interesting one. The first point I'd make is that obviously historically juries don't and shouldn't have the power to convict in spite of a lack of evidence. That's a very different thing to having the power to acquit in spite of a wealth of evidence. And it's right to say that the point of a jury being a safeguard is not that they then are able to simply admonish their responsibility as fact finders, because it's a dual process. You find the facts that are necessary for guilt, and then you say, well, according to my conscience, are these people actually guilty? You can't say, well, there's no evidence, but I'm going to look them up anyway because I think they're dastardly. And I think if a jury did that, I would be critical of the verdict. I don't think there's anything wrong with being critical of a jury's verdict. And, you know, I think there are a number of verdicts which I would, in recent times, having had limited knowledge of the evidence, that I might disagree with. But that's actually, they're helpful verdicts because they show that, for example, the recent cases involving historic sexual abuse allegations, I've been surprised when looking at the evidence that's come out and the allegations that have been made, that some of these have resulted in convictions. I found it surprising. But that's not to say that had I been sitting in the court, I might have made a different might have formed a different view, but also that it shows that the discussions that have been happening around those allegations aren't concluded, and society is very divided over them, and the jury is an illustration of that point. The verdicts, I think, are a helpful illustration that people don't think uniformly about the status of these allegations, and the moral reaction to them is mixed. I think that's illustrated in the verdicts that we've seen. So, jury research, well, I think jury research and researching, I mean, in this country we can't research how juries make their decisions in respect of particular cases. I think you can undertake test cases. Obviously the courtroom imbues the setting with a degree of seriousness not present in a focus group. But I think it goes back to the point I made about giving reasons. I would hate the idea that you would ever be able to inquire into how juries make the decisions in this country, because what that would do is basically say that the jury have to be held to account for what they decide. And really, the point was made in an earlier session that what we are in danger of losing sight of in the criminal justice system today is that the whole trial is for the jury, really. It's not the purpose of the trial is not to satisfy the defendant, it's not to satisfy the victim, it's to satisfy society, and society is encapsulated in the jury. And I think we're in real danger of losing sight of that. So to ask the jury in any form to explain the decisions that they've made, I think would just be absolutely fundamentally undermining the point of them being there in the first place. So, bad character evidence. Well, look, one thing I would say is we have these arguments all the time about what can and can't go before a jury. I mean, it's very difficult to get anything excluded, I have to say that. And if it does get excluded, it's usually sort of token gesture from the judge, so it makes it appear as though there's a degree of fairness to the trial. Maybe that's me being too cynical. But I would say this, a lot of these previous convictions go before juries and they weigh them up appropriately. So juries get directed, and I mean, I don't think they need to be directed, but if you get told that someone has done something, let's take this room for example. Does anyone in this room think that if they heard that someone had burgled a house before, that they necessarily would have burgled the house you're being asked to decide upon? No, you'd reserve your judgment. You know, if he'd done it 50 times, you might think it more likely than someone who'd never burgled a house before. It's just common sense. And juries get basically told what common sense is by the judge. They'll be told things like, don't conclude that he's guilty just because he's done it before. If you think this establishes a propensity, then you can use that to support certain aspects of the prosecution case, etc., etc., etc. Everyone thinks that way anyway. It's just that we don't trust them to think that way. The judge doesn't trust them to think that way. Lawyers don't trust them to think that way. So I really think the kind of bad character stuff, I think one, I think it's relatively useless in doing anything about the trial process. But I think juries are pretty capable of taking the evidence that they receive about bad character and judging it and analysing it. And you know, we've tried to take cases to the Court of Appeal on the basis that that convictions have been wrongly allowed in. And quite often they say, well, the jury were perfectly capable of assessing its validity in the context of the case. I think that's generally the right position to take. Democratisation. One thing about the jury is it's one of the last vestiges where people are trusted to make really important decisions in everyday life, and it's one of those areas which has been resilient to reform in the face of, you're right, a broader trend away from popular decision making, and that's why I think above all else it's worth defending and promoting to the rest of the world. I wouldn't call myself a supremacist. I call myself someone who believes in the system that we've got and is willing to argue its virtues. And you know, I think I'd be more worried in being on trial in the Netherlands and South Africa than I would be here, simply because I trust my fellow people more than I do any appointed professional or any judge to handle my fate. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Andrew?
Well, yeah, first of all, the idea of more research going on into juries and how they operate, I mean, yeah, why not? I mean, it's easy to be in favour of research, why not? But it's a way of kicking an issue down the road, like opening a judicial inquiry or whatever these days. We can all be in favour of more research. If you're standing by a system where you have judicial or legal decisions being made without reasons, then there is only so much playing around with the formula that you can do. I think it comes down again to that distinction between Luke's and Carl's arguments that we had earlier. Are we talking about something that is just empirically more effective, or are we talking about something else? Are we talking about sort of democratic input into the legal decision-making process? And I think what you would have to do as someone in favour of juries is you find a way of making the system sort of, to some degree, immune to the empirical argument. You know, maybe there isn't too much that we can do in terms of tweaking the formula, because the empirical evidence isn't everything. But you know, by all means, let's have some more. I mean, it's interesting reading at any rate. We had some talk about the vindictiveness, the sort of vindictive groupthink of officials. I think that is quite interesting. I think without sort of becoming too much of a sort of legal realist about things and just saying, oh, well, you know, judges are just giving effect to their policy preferences. You do see it in the way that prosecuting authorities and police forces sometimes act. I mean, going back to the Davani case, there was commentary by some South African journalists and columnists saying, well, you know, look, essentially they didn't like these uppity foreigners coming here and showing off their bling. So on some level, they were just out to hammer Sri and Davani and sort of in some places, willfully misconstrued the evidence that was available, which, given the quality of South African law enforcement, it was quite easy to do. I think the fundamental question is this question about democracy and the extent to which you imbue your legal system with democratic ideals. I think a lot of people would say that the two things are necessarily quite separate, and that there is no room for democracy in law, and that if you're concerned about democracy, you need to go over to your legislative system and your political system and fix that, rather than focusing on the legal system per se. I just want to add that, you know, I'm not particularly wedded to the concept of diploc courts at all, so I'm perfectly willing to accept the idea that they were just a way of banging up Republican terror suspects, which, of course, as a judge, you can do, or you're bound to do, rather, if that's what the law says. So you don't have that ability to render a perverse verdict if you're a judge.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of the time, so I think we'll take 3 more questions from the audience, then we'll have final remarks.
Jury research. I'm against it. The reason why I'm against it is because you cannot justify a political concept in a technical or scientific way. It's very interesting that the lady who raised the question of jury research, I believe, clearly has her own prejudices, because she suggested that there was a problem in the jury room of groupthink and the possibility that a jury might be swayed by the colour of a barrister's suit. Now, I may have my own prejudices, in which case, I have no doubt my prejudices go in the other direction. I have no problem at all in trusting jurors to reach a true verdict on the evidence and in accordance with justice. But my point is this: we all have prejudices. We all approach these issues with different ideas and different beliefs. You can only resolve them by having the argument in a public forum. You cannot shunt those questions off to researchers, to technical people who are going to so-called analyse the data in a scientific and boundary-free way. It simply doesn't work like that. And one of the problems, actually, of the people who always argue for jury research is that fundamentally they don't like juries, because they do have a rather distorted view of the way that humanity works. That's why they don't feel comfortable with the notion of juries. And that, coming back to the argument that we started with, is why fundamentally I believe so strongly in juries. It was Lord Devlin who once described the jury as like a little parliament. He said it is the lamp that shows that freedom lives. And he's absolutely right to focus in on the democratic element behind jury trial. That the essential justification for a jury, and it's a very powerful justification, is that it is a profound statement from the state that every single one of us, you, me, and everyone else who may sit on a jury, can be trusted to put aside their prejudices, to engage with the evidence on a rational basis and reach a true and fair verdict. I'm all for juries.
Okay, so I'll turn back to the panel. We'll start with Carl.
Research. I don't agree. The research, to me, protects the jury system. It shows us that it's not unfair. That's what the research tells me. So I don't think defenders of the jury need to be afraid of research. Quite the opposite, in fact. I think we can dish myths about the jury through research. Why is the jury under attack? 2 reasons, I think. First, everything in the legal system and the judicial system comes under attack, and the fundamental reason for that is that half the time, at least, people lose. There are always losers in the jury system. In the legal system, there are always going to be losers before juries. So not everybody can be happy with anything in the legal system. Secondly, there's an increasing professionalisation of everything. We certainly see this in politics, where the professional politician has taken over, I think, to the detriment of our democracy. And it's maybe part of that trend. There's, you know, I keep going on about a professional elite, and I think it's them who don't trust juries. They're fallible too. Somebody said the reason jurors Google and things is because there's something wrong with the system. I don't think it's that. There's something wrong with humanity. There's just something, you know, people are not perfect. But my point is that's jurors and it's judges and it's lawyers and everyone. Other points I've got to make. I feel like I should be an honorary ambassador to the Netherlands today, because I'm going to sort of defend them again. Something they do in Holland, which we, or many of us, instinctively react negatively to, is their press is much more restrained in the reporting of crime, as far as I can see. Certainly, don't name defendants. They tend to use initials and things. Now, my reaction to that is to be quite horrified that it's really controlling open justice. But, I don't know, it's the kind of, we should think about that and whether it helps. It's the kind of thing, whether we adopt it or not, we could learn from another country about. Finally, my final system, you cannot, my argument has never been about effectiveness, actually. It's hopeless to try and decide whether juries have got things right, or anybody. You can never do that. We can never know. So it's hopeless to try to decide this question on that basis. This is a political choice about power. That's all it is. And it's who you prefer to have this power. I prefer juries to have that power. Not partly because of the state and checking the power of the state, but also going beyond that to check the power of elite professionals who think they know better. I don't think they do.
Thank you, Carl.
I'm glad I agreed to take part in this debate because I think it's helped us clarify a lot of our concepts. I think in many ways the greatest threat to the jury system, as has been alluded to throughout this debate, is the muddle of concepts deployed by defenders of the jury system. So we have this thing of utility versus political morality. And at the end of the day, I think if we want to defend the jury system, we have to plump solely for the latter. But then, in a way, that brings us to another problem, because it means that we have to answer fundamental questions about what we think the role of law is. Even if we accept, and I accept, the proper role of juries within the system of criminal law, we still have to answer the question of what do we do with the rest of the law? What do we do with civil law? Is it something that we're going, is the jury system something that we're going to bring back wholesale in civil trials? And if so, on what sort of basis? I'm grateful for Kerry's intervention from the floor about being judgmental when it comes to extolling the virtues of our jury system. Because I think if it's going to survive and thrive and not become a minority esoteric pursuit, we have to be judgmental about it. Even if, going back to my earlier analysis, we do not, or we consider it as being some sort of bolt-on optional extra to a legal system, we have to be very keen about pushing that forward and saying, even if it is an extra, it is an asset to your political culture as a whole. It's something that we need to not shy away from in the name of not being judgmental. It's all about being judgmental at the end of the day.
Thank you. Luke.
There is a real difference between a contractual dispute and a criminal trial. The former involves a technical question which can be legitimately answered by a professional. The latter, the criminal trial, involves matters of social morality. It involves all of us, each and every one of us, in the widest, everywhere. The reason it affects all of us is because what's being decided is whether or not the person on trial should continue to have the right to live amongst us in most serious cases. That is why a jury is vital to a criminal trial, where they're not vital to a contractual case, because the question at stake affects everyone. And I think the more that we allow the jury system to become beholden to research, to expertise, to professional opinion, quite simply, we lose the fundamental point of the jury system, which is to allow us all, in the way that we can within the jury system, to have a say in matters that concern us. So, what's the final conclusion? The final conclusion is juries matter because we matter. We matter in the social processes that we've constructed. Our decisions count. our judgments should be trusted, we should trust one another. And the more we start to believe that, the more, frankly, the more the whole world starts to believe that, the more we can start moving towards a justice system in which we have a stake rather than one in which we are removed from the presence of professionals.
Thank you, Luke.